Camping alone at night always seemed like the ultimate test of self-reliance. No cell phones, no human contact. Just you, the wilderness, and the raw reality of nature. That's what I told myself as I pitched my tent deep in the heart of hollow pine forest, far from any trails or campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my mind and prove I wasn't afraid of being alone. I wasn't afraid of being alone, at least not until that night. The first few hours were peaceful. As twilight descended, the forest around me came alive with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoots of owls. I set up camp near a small clearing, the kind of place that felt untouched, as if no one had stepped foot there in decades. It was perfect, too perfect, perhaps. By the time I got the fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blacks. The warm glow of the flames made the shadows around me dance, and the air grew colder with every passing minute. I sipped from a thermos of coffee, watching the stars blink into view. That's when I first noticed it, the silence. Not the natural, comforting silence of the woods, but an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The usual hum of insects had vanished, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. I brushed it off as paranoia. It was probably the quiet before a storm or something. But then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the non-existent breeze. A soft murmur, just at the edge of hearing. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it came. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "The wind," I said aloud, my voice breaking the eerie quiet. "It's just the wind." Still, a shiver ran down my spine. I fed another log into the fire and tried to focus on the warmth, on the rhythmic crackling of burning wood. But the feeling lingered, like I was being watched. I glanced around, the darkness beyond the firelight impenetrable. My flashlight sat next to me, but I didn't want to reach for it, didn't want to illuminate whatever might be out there. I told myself there was nothing to see, just the woods, just the night. The whisper came again, this time closer. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, low and raspy, as though someone, or something, was trying not to be heard. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The woods answered only with silence. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and grabbed the flashlight. Sweeping the beam around the clearing, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. My fire seemed smaller now, its glow swallowed by the surrounding darkness. The whisper didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I told myself to relax. "You're scaring yourself," I muttered. "It's just your imagination." But imagination doesn't leave footprints. The ground near the edge of the clearing was soft, and there, illuminated by my flashlight, were tracks. They weren't mine. Bare feet, pressed deep into the dirt, as if whoever or whatever had made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail with the beam, but it disappeared into the underbrush. I backed toward the fire, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but the thought of venturing into the pitch-black forest terrified me more than staying put. The fire was my only safety, the only barrier between me and whatever was out there. And then the whispers returned, louder, surrounding me. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered, overlapping, like a chorus of the damned. They came from all directions, ebbing and flowing like waves, too faint to understand but too clear to ignore. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting through the trees, but there was no one there, no one I could see. The whispers grew closer, sharper. I could feel them crawling into my ears, into my mind. My thoughts turned frantic. I grabbed my pack and started shoving my things inside, desperate to leave, to escape this nightmare. But as I turned toward the tent, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the darkness. The firelight caught its face, or what should have been its face. It had no features, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull-like head. Its body was cloaked in shadows, its limbs impossibly long, its posture unnatural. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, its beam flickering before going out entirely. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. Or was it? How could something without eyes watch me? My hands scrambled for the flashlight, and when I clicked it back on, the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulder, abandoning the tent. I didn't care anymore. I just had to get out. The path back to my car was barely visible in the dark, but I ran blindly, crashing through branches and tripping over roots. The whispers followed me, growing louder, angrier. I could feel them clawing at my mind, pulling me toward something I couldn't see. And then the laughter began. It was faint at first, a low, guttural chuckle that sent chills down my spine. But it grew louder, more manic, echoing through the trees. My legs burned as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped, trying to catch my breath. But the laughter didn't stop. It was everywhere, bouncing off the trees, coming from every direction. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly. And then I saw them, figures, dozens of them, emerging from the trees. Their bodies were pale and skeletal, their faces smooth and featureless. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their heads cocked at odd angles. The laughter grew louder, echoing from their formless mouths. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. They surrounded me, closing in slowly, their limbs contorting as they moved. The whispers returned, louder than ever, drilling into my skull. I screamed. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I was lying in the clearing, my pack and flashlight nowhere to be found. My tent, my fire, everything was gone. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the night before had been a dream. But it wasn't. The footprints were still there, and on the ground beside me, scrawled into the dirt, were the words, "You belong to us now." There's something about being alone in nature that feels both peaceful and unsettling. I've always prided myself on being someone who could disconnect, who could find solace in the silence of the wilderness. That's why, on a whim, I decided to go camping alone in the deep woods of Cedar Creek National Forest. It was meant to be a weekend of reflection, a chance to clear my head and recharge. I had read the warnings about camping alone, about how remote the place could feel at night, but I didn't think much of it. I'd camped alone before, and the isolation only made me feel more connected to the world around me. At least, that's what I told myself as I hiked into the woods, the sun sinking behind the towering pines, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the trail. The first night was perfect. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brighter than I had ever seen them. I set up my tent in a secluded spot near a small creek. The soft babbling of water was soothing, and I built a fire, watching the flames dance as I sat back, enjoying the serenity. But as the night wore on, I began to feel an odd tension in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath. The sounds of the woods, the distant chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, began to fade. An unnatural silence fell over the area, leaving only the crackling of my fire. I brushed it off. It was probably just the calm before the storm, I thought. After all, the forest was vast and ancient, could be unnervingly quiet sometimes. I had just finished my dinner when I heard something, a soft sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the edge of the forest. I froze. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, a low, almost indistinguishable murmur, as if someone or something was speaking from the darkness. My heart rate quickened, and I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. There was nothing there. It was then that I realized how utterly alone I was. There was no one for miles around, just the woods and me. The thought of that, of being truly isolated, made the whispers seem even more unsettling. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the fire, but the feeling of being watched crept up my spine. I was being paranoid, I told myself. The wind played tricks on you out here. I grabbed my flashlight and made a circle around my camp, shining the beam through the trees. The beam of light darted across the forest floor, catching glimpses of bushes and fallen logs, but nothing that could explain the noise. Satisfied that it was nothing, I returned to my fire, though my sense of unease lingered. I sat back down, determined to shake it off. As the firelight flickered, I let my mind wander, but my thoughts kept returning to the whispering. It was faint now, barely audible, but it wasn't gone. It wasn't the wind. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that sent my heart racing. It was a thump, a soft but distinct noise, like something heavy falling to the ground. My eyes shot open, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The fire had burned low, and the surrounding darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating. Another thump. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam trembled in my hand as I scanned the clearing. Nothing. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their branches creaking, but there was no sign of anything amiss. Thump. It was closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, my feet unsteady as I approached the noise. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness, amplifying my own fear. My flashlight beam caught something in the distance. Something small, half hidden beneath the shadow of a tree. I took a cautious step forward. It was a bundle of clothes, a jacket crumpled on the ground, its fabric twisted as if something had been hastily discarded. But there was no sign of anyone nearby. No footprints, no movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the realization hit me. Someone had been here. Someone had been close. The whispering returned, clearer now, almost like a low chant, coming from all directions. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too purposeful. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent once again. But the feeling of eyes upon me grew stronger. There was something out there, something watching me, but I couldn't see it, couldn't place it. I made my way back to the fire, my heart racing. I sat down and tried to calm myself, but every shadow seemed deeper now, every crack of a twig more menacing. The fire flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows that stretched and shifted unnaturally, like they were alive. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind. The forest was known to play games with your senses, especially in the dark. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The second night was worse. The air was thick with tension, and the wind had picked up, making the trees groan and sway ominously. The whispers were louder now, almost like voices, and they came from different places each time. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to me, urging me to leave. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I didn't need to. I knew that it wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. I was packing my things when I noticed something strange. The campfire had burned down to a few embers, casting a faint glow, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. There, in the dirt, near the edge of my campsite, were fresh footprints. They were large, too large to be mine, and they led off into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I had been alone in the camp all day. There was no one else out here. No one else could have made these prints. The whispers grew louder, and a chill ran through me. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the footprints, my steps shaky but determined. The trail led deeper into the woods, twisting and turning, as if it were deliberately trying to confuse me. I was almost running now, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. The trees seemed to bend and shift in my peripheral vision, but whenever I looked directly at them, they were still. Then I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and unnaturally still, standing at the edge of a small clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its head should have been. Its limbs were long, too long, and it stood there, unmoving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The figure took a step forward. I turned and ran. I ran until I could no longer hear the whispering, until my legs gave out beneath me. I stumbled into a small ravine, hidden in the thick underbrush, and collapsed there, trying to catch my breath. I could still feel the presence of the thing, the shadow, pressing on my back, waiting for me to move. I didn't sleep, couldn't. By morning, I was gone. I left everything behind, my tent, my gear, my pack. I didn't care about anything anymore except getting out. I haven't gone camping since. It's been weeks, but I can still hear the whispering. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I hear it when the wind blows, when the world falls quiet at night. Sometimes it's soft, almost distant. Other times it's right behind me, too close for comfort. I know it wasn't my imagination. I know what I saw, and I know that whatever was in those woods, it's still out there, waiting. I had always considered myself an outdoorsman, comfortable in the woods, alone with my thoughts, or so I thought. There's something about the stillness of nature that calls to me. It wasn't unusual for me to take a weekend trip into the woods for some solitude, to escape the noise of the city and let my mind unwind. This particular weekend, I ventured to a secluded spot in Bear Hollow, a stretch of forest I had camped in before. It was an hour's hike from the nearest trailhead, deep enough that the only sounds you could hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of owls. I set up camp around late afternoon, well before nightfall. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a gentle breeze that made the trees sway in soothing rhythm. My tent was pitched by a small creek, and I gathered some dry wood for a fire, the crackling flames soon flickering in the fading daylight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep silence fell over the camp. Not even the crickets were chirping. I found it odd, but I didn't think much of it. The forest was vast, and maybe I just wasn't used to it being so still. I sat by the fire, eating a meal I had prepared earlier and sipping from my canteen. The warmth of the fire and the solitude gave me a sense of peace. But as night settled in, something felt off. It wasn't a feeling I could describe. More like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to stay alert. First, I thought it was nothing, just nerves. But then I heard it, a soft rustling from the woods, somewhere off to the left. My head snapped in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. The trees, thick with leaves, were still. The fire crackled louder than the forest. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, and I stood up to add a few more logs to the fire. The light danced, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground, making the surrounding trees seem to sway unnaturally. It was then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. I froze, heart racing, as I looked to the edge of the camp. There, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but the figure was too distinct to ignore. A tall, dark shape standing motionless at the tree line. I squinted, but the figure didn't move. It was just standing there, facing me. "Hello," I called out, my voice suddenly trembling. There was no response. I stared at the shadow for what felt like an eternity, but it never moved. My instincts told me to get up, to leave the fire and investigate, but my body refused to cooperate. I felt rooted to the spot, the weight of dread anchoring me in place. I shook my head, dismissing it as some wild animal or perhaps a trick of the firelight. But the unease lingered. The rustling from earlier started up again, this time closer, followed by an odd scraping sound, like nails against bark. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam pierced the darkness, but when it swept over the area where the figure had been, there was nothing there. Just trees. No sign of life. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the tension, but the air had grown thick with an unshakable sense of foreboding. I quickly sat back down by the fire, my hands trembling slightly as I poked at the embers. Minutes passed, and the woods seemed to grow colder. A deep chill began to creep into the air. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, but no matter what I did, the cold seemed to settle into my bones. I felt watched, as if something unseen was lurking just outside the circle of firelight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then I heard it. A voice, low and barely audible, drifting through the stillness. "Leave." I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't a human voice. It was raspy, distant, and hollow. It seemed to come from all around me, as though the very forest itself was speaking. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear from my voice. The only response was the crackling of the fire and the wind stirring the trees. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the darkness pressing in closer. I aimed my flashlight toward the treeline again, but there was no figure, no sign of movement. I started to feel ridiculous. I was just getting paranoid. I turned away from the fire, my back to the trees, and went to retrieve my sleeping bag from my tent. But as I bent down, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, like a footstep too heavy to be ignored. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, followed by a low, grating laugh that chilled me to my core. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but nothing was there. The laughter, though faint, lingered in the air, echoing in my ears. I felt my pulse spike. Something was wrong, very wrong. I grabbed my backpack and hurriedly shoved my things inside the bag, not caring how I was packing. I needed to get out of there. I had to leave. The forest had grown silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, oppressive, suffocating. Like the woods were waiting. As I finished packing, I looked up toward the trees. That's when I saw them. Hundreds of them, all around me. At first, I thought I was imagining things, the glare from my flashlight distorting the shadows. But no, there were eyes, pale and glowing, dotted throughout the trees. They were wide and unblinking, watching me with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. I turned and bolted. The forest seemed to close in behind me, the ground beneath me shifting like something alive, trying to trip me up. My breath was ragged as I sprinted, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. But no matter how fast I ran, the eyes were always there, watching from the dark, just out of reach. I could hear the rustling of branches, the soft thud of footsteps too close for comfort. Something was following me, and it was getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I stumbled, falling hard onto the ground, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself back up and kept running, my body screaming with exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the dim lights of the trailhead in the distance. I was almost there. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, and I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp. I reached the trailhead, gasping for air, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, the panic rising in my chest. When I finally got in, I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I looked out the window one last time. The woods were silent again, but I could still see those eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring at me from the edge of the trees. It's been weeks since that night, but I can still feel the eyes on me. Even now, as I sit in my apartment, the shadows seem deeper, the silence too loud. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can hear that low, grating laugh echoing in the back of my mind. I know what I saw, and I know those eyes aren't finished with me yet.